three basic categories of economic use. Local livelihoods, so fishers, those who directly depend on the sea for their survival and economic livelihood. Then there's the resource extraction of fish and seabed resources, oil and gas, and of course seabed minerals prospectively. And then there is the sea as a flow space for maritime trade. I won't repeat the statistics. I think we're all familiar with the importance of the South China Sea as a transit point between regions and for major movements of minerals and energy flows from across the world. I'd just like to refer back briefly to President Marcos's keynote, where he mentioned a couple of things in relation to the South China Sea. Please, if you'd like to fill the seats in front, it might be easier for you to look at the slides as well. So please come up front, don't be shy. President Marcos said that the South China Sea functioned as an economic connector and also as the location of arteries of global commerce. So I think that was wound into the narrative, the keynote narrative. And I think the interest in the South China Sea as a flow space, if I can call it that, for commerce is global and uncontroversial. The more difficult area is around resource extraction, because obviously that gets into the question of who owns what and the claims that are disputed both in sovereignty and in maritime jurisdiction. But we've heard a lot about the UN Law of the Sea. The Law of the Sea itself encourages joint development between disputants, partly to build confidence. So you don't have to sort out your boundaries before you enter into cooperation. It's flexible. It's left up to the flexibility of the disputants themselves to actually do that. And we've seen some attempts, some successful, some less successful already in the South China Sea to do exactly that. There are some examples amongst the ASEAN countries, for example, Brunei and Malaysia, which I think was mentioned in one of our earlier sessions, to move towards progressing their maritime boundary disputes with a view to entering into joint development. I think the key principle on that is, as long as you know where exactly people are claiming, then it's possible to make an arrangement around equity in terms of joint development. Of course, the biggest problem in the South China Sea is the ambiguity about China's claim. So it's very difficult to enter into joint development without that full disclosure. And we've seen, therefore, I think some attempts to do that. Here in the Philippines a few years ago, some of you remember the JMSU, the Joint Maritime Survey Undertaking, where there was an attempt to at least to try to move forward on that. But I think that the sticking point there was really around the ambiguity about the extent of the Chinese claim. More recently, however, we've seen Indonesia with under a new president showing a bit more of a pragmatic approach to moving joint development forward with China. Nothing's happened in concrete terms about that, but that's been controversial in Indonesia because it's also run over the long-standing position that China's dispute is not officially recognized. So that's in an interesting state at the moment. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to comment further on that. But just to finish my opening introductory comments, I think that's a key challenge, is how to pursue economic cooperation without giving legitimacy to what is, in legal terms, an illegitimate claim. That's a very thorny challenge to which there's no obvious solution. But I hope that our panelists will be positively inclined to maybe suggest not just the obstacles, but also the potential ways forward. And with that in mind, let's get straight underway with our first panelist, Jonathan Berkshire-Miller, who's a senior fellow from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa, Canada. Jonathan, over to you.
Well, this is a great mic as well. It's nice and cozy in here. The good thing that we won't have to worry about shouting at each other, even if it gets heated. It's a nice, cozy environment here. So, Ewan, thanks. You did a great setting there of the scene. So I'm not going to belabor some of the points that you've mentioned. So let me just start with a few stimulating thoughts, and I really hope this is a conversation. One of the benefits of this room here is that we can benefit from everyone in the room's questions and their insights as well. So the first one, and I hate to be a bad student sort of questioning the premise of the teacher here, but when I looked at the onset and the title of this panel and looking at economic security and traditional maritime security and seeing it as a nexus, I think my first overarching point is that we have to get it out of our heads of this old false bifurcation of traditional security on one side, trade and investment and economic security on the other side. And I think the South China Sea is one of the clearest examples of this. It doesn't mean that security has to be everything and that we securitize the entire discussion. But I think that we do have to recognize that when we're talking about some of the economic security equities in this region, you highlighted a number of them. Of course, the energy choke points, the livestock here, the fish, et cetera, is very important for the food security of the region and for the energy security, not just of littoral states in the South China Sea, but all the way from Manila to Montreal, from Singapore to Santiago. I mean, this is what happens in the South China Sea reverberates beyond the South China Sea. But I think the first important point is that we need to get away from this false bifurcation of economic security and traditional security on the one hand. The second part is sort of why this nexus matters, and I think you sort of went into this very importantly. Was, of course, we have the trade side, we have the energy side, but it goes beyond that. And I think I'm hoping that we get into this through the panel, is the importance of involving private sector actors. If we're talking about economic security, this is not something that we're going to figure out just governments themselves, but this goes into shipping companies, this goes into insurance questions. This is more than just a discussion that can be resolved through ASEAN-related forums or through government-to-government discussions. This absolutely is something that needs to be held in a public-private discussion as well. So that's the second point. Of course, we could belabor the point on why the nexus matters, but we all know how critical of an artery the South China is for the economies of the littoral states, but more broadly, the world. And I don't need to belabor on this panel some of the data points and the financial points on that. The third sort of point is that economic coercion, and I think that's actually come up. It came up in the last panel. It's come up throughout the conference. Is a design feature that's not unique to the South China Sea. I think many partners in the broader Indo-Pacific and actually some of our European friends have been suffering from different layers of economic coercion. So when we're talking, I mean, we could use a number of different examples from arbitrary import bans, tourism cutoffs, investment freezing, informal embargoes. There's so many different examples we could use. But is that when we're talking about this needs to be a constant feature and design feature of our discussions with some of the like-minded groups that we're having these conversations with, is that economic coercion is a reality, and we should be learning some of the experiences that are not necessarily in the South China Sea and how they reflect on the situation here in Southeast Asia. This sort of leads me just to kind of finish up a few of my points, is sort of the so what do we do about it? And I think part of this is, of course, dialogue is important. I don't think this all needs to be about resilience and finding like-minded groups that we can have diversification and redundancy. I think we do have to have dialogue and discussion, and I'm hoping today that we hear a lot of that discussion amongst our panel. But I think it does lead me to some of the other points on what we can be doing and what we should be doing. I do think the diversification question, looking at some of the main areas that are being weaponized through economic coercion, which state parties or which actors which private sector parties could help us in having those supply chains being more resilient. So just to give you one example on critical minerals, I think that there's other players outside of the South China Sea that could help fill some of that void in case there's economic coercion that's being leveraged on some of the littoral actors in Southeast Asia on critical minerals. Energy security, I think, is another factor. It seems like a selfish plug as a Canadian to say that we're an option as well, but you could traverse through the Western Pacific and not have to worry about the South China Sea. You may have to worry about the Arctic and other factors, but there are other supply chains that can get some of those resources to you. The sort of last thing I'll mention here, as far as some of the things that we can do, just a few ideas, is this is not just a international discussion about what we could do with some of our partners, but it's also a domestic discussion. So I know we've been talking cooperatively here about what we should be doing together, but I think we need to be soul searching a lot domestically about actually thinking about what economic security means to us in this context. So if we're having this conversation about the nexus between economic security and maritime security, we have to be honest with ourselves that many of our ministries don't even have a setup or forensic design to actually to have real robust discussions on economic security. We also don't have, going to my first point, many of us don't have the real good mechanisms to engage with our private sector actors to, number one, to hear their reflections, to hear their stories on this, but to really drive forward a program that truly is public-private by nature. So I think that's, a point I'd want to leave on and get some reflections from other states in the region, what sort of steps you've done, both from a government perspective, but also to engage with your private sector on this discussion of economic security. And just sort of finally, I would mention infrastructure protection, I think, is a really important one, too, that we should be thinking about. We all rely and we all benefit on some of the infrastructure in the region. And if it's being leveraged or if coercion is being used against some of those infrastructure projects, of course, undersea cables, we had a robust discussion on that already here. This dialogue is one example of it, but there's many other examples of infrastructure that benefits all. But if it's being leveraged for one or two parties' interests, that's something that I think we need to come to terms with and have a discussion on. So I'll leave it there for now and really look forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, that was a really helpful opener, Jonathan. Not simply a Canadian perspective, but I think you took forward the challenge to put some flesh on the bones of those broad contours, reminding us also of that critical link to bring governments and private sector actors together, and just relating that back, since you are from Canada, it's apparent to me that Canada's not well known for beating its own drum, you might say, but it is a consistent presence in the South China Sea and has actually stepped up, from its modest base of capabilities to be, I think, quite impressively present in the South China Sea, not always necessarily with a big asset, but even an offshore patrol vessel counts, because I think the point from a government perspective, presence legally and diplomatically makes the point in a way that making statements from Ottawa maybe doesn't. You've also made the point that Canada is there as an economic actor too, both in the South China Sea, but also because of its strong minerals base and in rare earths, also clearly, I think, a more important actor in the future. We'll go in the order that appears in the guidelines. So now I'd like to turn for a Philippines perspective to Professor Victor Manet, who is the President and CEO of Strat-Based Group. Victor, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Allow me to share some slides. So we might need to tilt a little, but we've argued in the Philippines that there's really this confluence of national security and economic security in trade and investments. And this is something that we have advocated, we have spoken about in the Philippines, and we put it in the broader context of the Indo-Pacific region, and we see how the Philippines has this strategic importance. When you see the map in a different way, when you speak of sea lanes, trade routes, data connectivity, even critical minerals, we have our own sources, and even supply chain diversification. Especially when you look at sea lanes, even the United Nations Conference on Trade reflects the importance of the West Philippine Sea. But when I speak of the West Philippine Sea, I always remind everyone that we're not talking about the South China Sea. It's what is given to us as our exclusive economic zone, our territorial seas, based on the UNCLOS. And through time, even though there is a claim that there is that 9-dash line, our own archipelagic sea lanes law, our own maritime zones, defines what we consider as ours. And that is what we try to protect maritime-wise. And within those seas, we see trade sea lanes passing through us. We see submarine cables. And this kind of reality really tells us how we connect our own maritime security with even the global geoeconomic situation. Some would even say confrontation. But in our case, our maritime security initiatives is actually supported by countries that are strong economic partners of the Philippines. Not only from data, which I'll share later, but even from our own public, the people itself. My institute, since 2013, have tracked how Filipinos view these countries. And those who have really stepped up in being with us in defending what we have won based on the arbitral award of 2016 reflects also our partners in the economy. There is this misconception, especially when you look at trade in the Philippines, we are the outlier in the ASEAN region. Our economy is not tied up to China. We are independent of China. And we have long argued that when we filed the case in January 2013 as compared to other ASEAN countries. We even have a negative or a big deficit vis-a-vis China, even our own investments. And when you look at our source of investments also, again, these are the countries that stand up with us in the maritime front. And maybe that makes us more independent in thinking. That makes us define what is our national interest vis-a-vis maritime, our territorial seas, our exclusive economic zones, because it also reflects our strong relationship. I always joke when you see Singapore there, these are basically multinational companies from the US and Europe who are based in Singapore. And when you look at this data, it reflects how we see in our own assertion. The latest data we had is just a few weeks back, is that these are the countries that stand up with us through time. And it reflects, again, these are across geographic area of the Philippines, across demographic area of the Philippines. And I share Dr. Miller's point of view that we need to bring the private sector. That's why when I look at the world, that maybe the economic fragmentation of the world today, and as we navigate this, I know there's a role for the state. But the state needs to engage with the private sector. Especially in the Philippines, we're heavy on the private sector. Heavy in different industries, they're the ones that create jobs. But the private sector, as they bring investment, that has driven growth in our country, it's also investment coming from like-minded countries that share with us the belief that we live in a rules-based order, and we are here with you, the Philippines and these countries, standing up for international law and defending, on our part, we will defend what is our maritime rights, our territorial integrity, but also work with like-minded countries, but also work with neighbors, no, to ensure peace and stability. And we have long advocated this in Stratbase. That's why we have fully supported this dialogue to get people to talk. We've also hosted discussions with the private sector and even the international community. So we jump from this opportunity to speak, to discuss, to share. I'll leave it with this, conscious of the time.
Marvelous. That was very concise and helpful, and brought things obviously back to where we are, the perspective on how the Philippines economy has developed. And I think it underlines the point that was made by our first presenter, that there isn't a false bifurcation between economics and security. The diverse base that you've underlined in terms of the trade structure of Philippines partners underlines, I think there's a heavy overlay with the growth in security partnerships too, which suggests that the two are closely linked. I just wanted to pick up maybe just a specific question, if I'm right in understanding this, but we talked about energy further, and if we could drill down, if you excuse the pun, to explore that in a little bit more detail, because the Philippines is, as far as I know, the only one of the littoral states in the South China Sea that currently doesn't have a major oil and gas project underway. Now, maybe I'm wrong in that understanding, and I'm maybe out of date. But given that the population of the Philippines is now well over 100 million people, if you were to put that, for example, into Europe, it would be by far the largest European state. Yet, in the Filipino mentality, sometimes we hear that it's a small country, but you have a large population growing fast with energy needs obviously going to continue to increase. To what extent is the South China Sea, or the West Philippine Sea, as I should say, in terms of your EEZ, how are you planning for that, both private sector and government-wise, for the potential to bring gas and to the extent that there's oil here online?
In the case of the Philippines, we have few developments, even within, not at the West Philippine Sea. So we have our own big gas operation developed by Chevron and Shell a few years back, and we're still drilling. I tend to say we because I'm the advisor of this project. I wear that other hat to support the institute. And there are a lot of interest also in, you'd say, areas that is well within our thoughts. But our problem really started, since you mentioned it even earlier, the JMSU. There's a place we call Recto Bank. It was never questioned. It was never disputed. Suddenly, after the Joint Maritime Seismic Understanding of 2008, 2007, it became part of the dispute. And that's one of the reasons. People think we filed the case in 2013. Again, I say we because I was one of the advisors at the time. Is we did not file the case only because of Scarborough Shoal. But our exploratory consortium trying to study the Recto Bank for future extraction, as we call it, of their natural gas was being harassed in that area. And that's one of the reasons. And that's also part of the result of the arbitration, that this is within our exclusive economic zone. So it's something that we continue to, we know it might be a flashpoint to continue. That's why the consortium has been suspended from further pushing. There was a time that I was even shepherding the entry of Western companies, but suddenly they back out because of strong pressure from Beijing. ExxonMobil, Shell. So I'm sharing some of my consulting secrets here now for your question. But we continue. There are a lot of engagement. It was an attempt even to talk to CNOC in the previous administration. But our concern was it has to be within our laws. And I think the last visit of President Xi here, he was open to sign a memorandum of agreement with our government then. But I think our government, 24 hours before, suddenly said, it had to be from the Philippine laws. If not, because our president then, his name is Duterte, would have been charged with treason if he signed that agreement. So that's why from there it's been put on hold, that area. But the rest of the country, there are a lot of attempts side by side with the development of renewables, offshore, solar, but natural gas would be a good transition for us, especially, as you've said earlier, the growing population.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. The Recto Bank is the Philippine name, but Reed Bank is
Reed Bank. Yeah, sorry, it's a Reed Bank.
It's the same
the Reed
thing
Bank.
we're talking about. Great. Well, that might be a challenge that our fourth speaker might want to take up as well, given that you've referenced the previous attempts to push cooperation forward with China, and that from the Philippines' perspective, is an option that remains open. Our third speaker today from Republic of Korea is Professor Chae Won-gi, and he's the head of the Center for ASEAN Indian Studies in the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. So from a perspective a little further north, Professor Chae, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm glad to be back to this forum after last year. And I'm particularly happy that I'm not anymore the only Korean participant in this forum. So this year we have more Korean representation. Because I'm working for a government think tank, I'd like to make it clear that my presentation is purely personal and does not represent my organization and position of the government of Republic of Korea. But I personally feel pretty confident that things I'm going to talk today is shared among growing number of people in policy community in Seoul. So I'll try to make three simple points in this opening remarks. First, while ROK's position on the South China Sea in the past has not been clearly communicated to the regional countries in this region, as well as the international community, but in recent years, Seoul has become increasingly clear about its interests and position on this issue. So I think this is very positive development. Second, well, the topic of this panel, the nexus between maritime security and economic security, I think the maritime coercions and confrontations in South China Sea are one of the key factors that have contributed to the greater economic security risks facing not only the regional claimant countries, but also extra-regional countries like South Korea. So we feel greater vulnerability in our economic security from what is happening in this part of the world. So my third point is that given the fact that maritime security is closely tied to economic security of the regional countries, I think you need to incorporate the element of the economic resilience. I don't think the security and defense measures are enough to come up with a robust kind of maritime strategy. I think you need to take a more holistic approach in which you have the defense, maritime, and all those factors, plus the elements that would enhance your economic resilience and things like that. So in that regard, I think South Korea, even if the strategic presence of South Korea in South China Sea issue has been very weak. But I think there are a lot of rooms in that regard Republic of Korea can play. So first, I'd like to briefly talk about ROK's position on the South China Sea. I think in terms of the interest, stakes, I think ROK has three key interests. The first one is, of course, the safety and security of the sea lanes of communication. I mean, the fundamental geo-economic reality of ROK is that ROK is a maritime trading nation, right? We don't have any continental trade. So the security of the slot in this region is very important. This is fundamental economic security interest. Second is that if you look at the trade profile of ROK, this whole region, Southeast Asia, is number 2, slightly after China. So the gap is decreasing. So we have increasingly greater economic stake here in this region. So Southeast Asia is our key export market, source of raw material, and a major investment destination. So strategic stability in this region is very important. This is closely tied to our economic prosperity. And third, I don't think it serves ROK's strategic interests if South China Sea becomes an exclusive sphere of influence controlled by a particular powerful country. So from a Korean perspective, it is essential that South China Sea remains a common global good, open to all nations, including extra-regional countries like South Korea. So, but if you look at from this angle, right, I mean, the South Korea's stance and position in the past has not been really well aligned with this key interest. I see a lot of disalignment and misalignments between the interest and Korea's diplomatic and strategic posture. I think the main source of this disalignment is the kind of geopolitical challenges unique to South Korea. Of course, everybody knows that we have the military threat from North Korea, right? Now, Kim Jong-un claims that it's a nuclear power. So, I mean, this is daunting challenge, a huge security liability. And also, because of this, the security preoccupation on North Korea, if you look at the strategic culture and strategic horizon, I mean, it's very narrowly kind of shaped, just focusing on Korean Peninsula. So this makes it very hard to look at South China Sea. And also we have a very complex and sensitive and even vulnerabilities vis-a-vis China, right? So, yeah, all of these things, these factors make it a little bit, influence our stance on South China Sea. But I believe that in recent years, the strategic community in Korea has been increasingly aware and wary of the repeated coercive and aggressive behaviors against the smaller littoral states. So I think we have increasingly clear stance and position on the legal implications and all the kind of things. So in this regard, I feel obliged to point out, even if it is very brief, about the recent China's unilateral maritime activities in our western coastal waters. I think a lot of colleagues here are already aware of this. Beijing has recently installed artificial structures in ROK's West Sea. Well, ROK and China have agreed to designate the area where the EEGs overlap as PMZ, Provisional Measures Zone. So no permanent structures, resource exploration, or boundary claims are not allowed in this PMG unless we have this kind of the agreement concluded, unless we conclude the maritime boundary demarcation negotiation. But this negotiation has been going on for the last 20 years, right? There is no progress. But we found that Beijing has deployed more than dozens of buoys, unilaterally installed a couple of massive structures, and also placed a huge fixed steel structure that used to be the oil rig platform. And also, we observed a gradual escalation of the Chinese activities. For example, February this year, Beijing tried to block our research vessels in this area. The Chinese armed Coast Guard ships blocked the maritime research vessel owned and operated by Kyost in Korea. And also May this year, Beijing unilaterally declared no sales zone in this area for its live fire drills. So Beijing claims that the structures they place in this PMG are just fishy farming facilities. Don't worry about this. This is not big deal, kind of. But Beijing's China's claim is highly dubious given the empirical evidences we have observed. The second one is economic security implications of the maritime coercions and disruptions. I mean, you already mentioned, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of different aspects of the security, economic security. But I think we need to recall what happened 2 years ago in Red Sea, right? I mean, the Houthis, rebel groups kind of seized some commercial cargo ships, right? Then you have all the massive global shipping delays and backlogs, huge increase in shipping costs, oil price hikes, and major supply bottlenecks in key commodities, right? So these kind of similar things could happen anytime if there are something serious happens in this part of the water, right? So finally, let me move on to the third part, the opportunities for cooperation. Well, in case of Philippines, what I observe is that the economic vulnerability of the Philippines is one of the major factors that make it very tough to mount a robust response to maritime coercions. In fact, I think in my observation, China takes advantage of its asymmetrical economic clout to propagate its narratives. I mean, in previous session, a lot of people talk about the narrative wars, right? My observation is that some Filipino people argue that the assertive transparency initiative under the current Marcos administration, right, is kind of strategic blunder. It's very unproductive and should be discarded. Why? Because unless, if you do not have this kind of anti-Chinese kind of hostile approach, you would have a lot of Chinese money, investments, and all those things, right? So, but other countries have a lot of Chinese investment, for example, Malaysia and other countries, right? So, I think this kind of narrative, I think this is kind of what Chinese really expect to propagate. And I see that even the Filipino domestic experts, some people are already talking about things as their genuine kind of domestic kind of narrative. So in conclusion, I argue that an effective response to maritime coercions require more than just the military and defense only measures. You need to have economic resilience component in the overall maritime strategy. So you need to have holistic maritime strategy. In that regard, extra-regional countries like ROK, Japan, and other countries could play some role. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for fleshing out that Korean view of both the South China Sea issue from a perspective from the peninsula, but also the comparison point to the local issues that Korea also faces and some of the commonalities in that situation. I think it's obvious to anyone who lives in Southeast Asia that the the investment and trade profile of Korea continues to grow. It's visible out on the streets, both in the commercial sector, but also as a source of arms increasingly in Southeast Asia. That shows that Korea, although sometimes tagged with being a mercantile strategy, is also having strategic effects. I think one question to my mind, given that you've, I think, sensibly brought us to the importance of broader resilience in national security, not simply defence as a standalone measure, and that's certainly part of the Australian conversation now, increasingly. What would be Korea's situation and response if, for example, there was a failure to flow supplies through the South China Sea? Because you've underlined that Korea, although it's not widely known, actually has one of the highest dependencies on the South China Sea in terms of its flow-in of resources, even more so than Japan, of course, and your geography is a bit more boxed in. So if there were to be an interruption to commercial traffic flowing through the South China Sea, has Korea already thought through and made preparations for that rather dark scenario? Yes.
Well, my answer is I don't know, right? But as far as my sense is that at the governmental level, I don't think we have a well thought out contingency plan. But I think South Korean companies, the big companies, I think they have their own plans. But that's corporate kind of classified secret, so they don't. But yeah, so given their risk assessment and my sense that the corporate sectors in South Korean business community, I think they are in preparation of the contingencies in this part.
Thank you. Okay, now we turn to Dr. Sophie Ushuang Yi, who was early on one of our plenary panels, so I think you've already had a chance to hear Sophie, and she works for the Grandview Institution in People's Republic of China as a marine and maritime specialist. Sophie, over to you. I think you have some slides, so for those who are able to, please have a look at the projector while Sophie gives her view.
Thank you. Thank you for my fellow panelists and Dr. Graham for your moderation. I think I'm just gonna I won't repeat again on the legal issues on the 9-dash line. I think we've talked enough about that already. But I will reiterate this, that these are the things that we cannot agree on. But I think I'm going to talk about something that we can agree on potentially. And I want to touch very briefly on what China has been doing about the maritime security and economic security. China has been sending around a PLAN forces to conduct anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. And that has been, they have been doing this, I think, since the late 2010s. And it has been quite effective and productive. We've seen less piracy activities in the region. And I want to also touch on the big issue here that many of the panelists have already talked about, economic coercion. I think the biggest economic coercion right now we are seeing is Trump's tariff war against literally everyone. By everyone, I mean they're doing it to Singapore as well. So I think if I can quote from the former, the senior diplomat, Kishore Mubani, Mr. Kishore Mubani, on what he said about China and the US. I think if you observe in Trump 1.0, the trade war started, China did not really have a clue of how we are going to protect our own economic interests. But in Trump 2.0, I think China's position is very clear, which is that in his own words, Kishore's own words, China drew a red line in the sand. If you hurt us, we'll hurt you equally painfully. And I think that is what China is doing. China is standing up as an opponent to the economic coercion imposed by Trump 2.0 administration right now. So I'll continue my presentation. Sorry. Okay. I'm gonna stick to my script because there's a lot of figures and data. I think I want to start by the verified facts, since data matters in these debates. For the Philippines specifically, the stakes are existential. The Philippine economy grew 5.7% in 2024. It was a very strong performance, but 90% of trade moved by sea. Overseas Filipino workers sent home a record of $38.3 billion in 2024. And I do need to remind you that there is a large population of Filipinos who works in Hong Kong specifically. So that constituted around 8.3% of Filipino GDP in 2024. This is money that feeds families, educates children, and stabilizes the economy. And now here's the economic reality that shapes strategic choices. China is the Philippines' largest import partner, nearly $29 billion in 2023, primarily in electronics, machinery, and intermediate goods. And a fact for you is that Singapore is actually the largest FDI, foreign direct investment investor in China. The United States is the largest export partner for Philippines. The Philippines is economically integrated with both powers simultaneously. And this creates structural constraints on Manila's foreign policy options. And by constraints, I suspect my fellow panelists are, representing Philippines, and I may have different views about in terms of how binding they should be. But before anyone suggests I'm advocating economic determination, let me be absolutely explicit. Economic interdependence does not justify compromising sovereignty. When my point is simply that we must acknowledge economic realities while defending legal and sovereign rights. Ignoring economics doesn't make constraints disappear. It just makes policy less effective. So I think I want to just briefly touch on the Filipinos' development trajectory and constraints. The Philippines invests approximately around 5 to 6% of GDP annually in infrastructure, 1.5 trillion Filipino pesos in 2024. And this represents significant commitment, but context matters. Indonesia and Vietnam both maintain fixed investment near 30% of GDP, comparing to the 5 to 6% of GDP that Philippines spends in infrastructure. President Marcos built better, more programs focused on transportation, connectivity, digital infrastructure, and green development. The PPP pipeline alone represents around 3.2 trillion Filipino pesos in potential projects. This investment isn't optional. It's essential for sustained economic growth, poverty reduction, and climate resilience in one of the world's most climate vulnerable countries. So now we reach a politically sensitive question. Where does the capital come from? So I think funding sources for the Philippines include the government budget, which is physically constrained, ODA from Japan and multilateral development banks like the ADB, which is helpful but sometimes insufficient. The private capital, as many of the panelists have mentioned, from potentially various sources, including Chinese investors who have been particularly eager to fund Southeast Asian infrastructure. Okay, I'm gonna just put this out. I'm also skeptical of arguments that the Philippines should categorically reject all economic engagement with China. I think that position is often easier to advocate from Canberra or Washington than from Manila, where development needs more immediate, capital is scarce, and millions of lives in poverty. Filipino policymakers must balance sovereignty protection in development imperatives. That's the dilemma, and it's real. So I'm going to talk just very briefly on Trump 1.0. I think I've already touched on that, but I'm going to skip to Trump 2.0. So we've all known that there has been tariff talks between China and the U.S. Tariffs were reduced from combined highs of around 145% down to kind of more manageable levels right now, with a 10% baseline maintained at both sides. China suspended rare earth export controls for at least 1 year. This is significant given China accounts for approximately 60 to 70% of global rare earth production, which is critical for semiconductors, defense systems, and electric vehicles. And on agricultural trade, Trump announced that China will buy immediately soybeans from the U.S. and progress on TikTok ownership negotiations. However, this is crucial. Technology export controls remain largely in place. I think that goes through to everyone that watch out for the chip wars that has been ongoing for a while. My assessment is that these are tactical pause, not strategic resolutions. For the Filipinos and ASEAN, this creates three possible scenarios. The most optimistic scenario would be reduced U.S.-China tension lowers regional economic disruption risks. It stabilizes supply chain and reduces pressure on Southeast Asian states to choose sides in every domain. The second, more pessimistic scenario would be temporary deals create false confidence that encourages over-investment based on stability assumptions. Then agreements will collapse, as happened with the Trump 1.0 phase on deal, leaving ASEAN exposed. The most likely scenario I give you would be transactional bilateralism continues between Washington and Beijing, with periodic deals and periodic flare-ups. ASEAN remains economically important. I think President Xi Jinping has made it very clear early this year that China is intended to maintain a friendly and workable relationship towards its neighbors, especially ASEAN. ASEAN remains economically important but strategically marginal to core U.S.-China decision-making, that said. I think this last scenario is most concerning for the Philippines. When great powers negotiate bilaterally, middle powers, specifically interests like Philippine sovereignty concerns in the South China Sea, can get lost or trace away in border bargaining. I think Manila needs to ensure its red lines on maritime sovereignty aren't really going to be compromising U.S.-China grand bargains, and to do that is to start a bilateral negotiation with China. And I have a few more slides on, talking about economic security, interdependence, navigating the complexity of that. I think the time for me is very constrained, so I'll go and just to look forward. There are actually very pragmatic cooperations despite tensions. For example, functioning resource management on fishery agreements, crisis management mechanisms, hotlines, multilateral frameworks, and economic security coalitions. And I'll jump to my conclusion. I think I want to start my conclusion with saying this. ASEAN has been the arena of proxy wars during World War II. We share the same kind of history and traumatic memories of what we have suffered during World War II. China has just celebrated the anniversary of anti-fascist wars this year. And I think the nexus of maritime and economic security in the South China Sea isn't a theoretical academic debate. It is the daily lived reality for both Chinese and Filipino fishermen who need safe access to fishing grounds, exporters who depend on stable shipping lanes, the families who rely on those incomes. The Philippines occupies a uniquely challenging strategic position. Economically integrated with China, security aligned with the United States. The geographically central to contested waters. Yes. So I think my response is very straightforward. There needs to be more clarity about violations of international law, and harmful actions is absolutely necessary, but it's insufficient by itself. We also need effective strategies that protect interests, advance prosperity, and reduce escalation risks. We cannot eliminate great power competition. It's structural and will persist. But we can manage its consequences through diversified partnerships, institutional guardrails, and realistic expectations about what's achievable. The South China Sea should remain what it has been for centuries, a corridor for commerce and shared prosperity connecting diverse peoples and economies, not become a theater of conflicts that devastated the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yi, for taking things into a sort of macro context of both the global economy and the headwinds, in particular the US-China headwinds that I think everyone in Southeast Asia is extremely attentive to. We've got a maximum of around 25 minutes just to give you some transit time to get back to the lunch forum, but a hard stop because we do have a 12:30 follow-on session. I want to now open up the floor panel phase. We've got some microphones, I think, that can be brought out.
Because Dr. Yi spoke of the Philippine economy.
You just want to respond to that?
Yes, totally different from my view, and I was born and lived here. Our economy is driven by remittances, true, but not by Hong Kong OFWs. Majority are actually, in terms of value, not a number, are coming from countries which are Western in nature because it has evolved through time. Second, after 6 years of very friendly, even appeasing relationship with China, what did we get? 0.99%, not 1% even, office investment went through the Philippines. And some of the BRI projects identified by then Duterte and then government of China were actually taken away from our public-private partnership projects. That means we did not need it to be done by a Chinese ODA. I can cite even one that we wanted to compare, and we published it, whereby a dam project done by China or offered never really went through. But on one hand, our PPP is now functioning. Started at the same time, studied at the same time. But the core of our economy is really consumption. How do we consume? We can only consume if we have jobs, aside from remittances. And jobs that drives our jobs is what we call the business process outsourcing industry, aside from our agriculture, our services, etc. And it's driven again by like-minded countries. Those are relationships. So, and just a final point, we are not here to confront our northern neighbor. Hotlines were shared with us, but nobody answers those hotlines. when there's conflict. Second, why did we have to file an arbitral victory? Because even ASEAN did not like us to speak about it in 2012. We have some diplomats here who can attest to that, Filipino diplomats. So we are not doing this because of competition between US and China. We're doing this because this is what is ours based on international law. And also, who stood up with us are countries that stands up with us economically also. That's how I understand the Philippine economy.
Okay, let's start. I saw the lady in the front row, and I'll take questions in batches of 3 to start. Please say who you are and if your question is directed to any panelists, and a maximum of 1 question each, please.
Okay, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this panel. I finally can speak a little bit. I'm Chen Fanting from IDJetro, based in Japan, Tokyo. And my research topics more focused on the environment and economy. And so I'm just wondering that now, COP is happening in Brazil, and all of the countries have NDCs, and all the countries are moving forward a decarbonized era and dealing with the crisis of climate change, right? So I'm really wondering that there's a lot of cooperation already happening in the region in terms of green economy, in terms of green infrastructure. So my question is there any possibility for these countries and can move forward together in terms of, because you already mentioned about the energy supply, the green energy issues. So is there any possibility for these countries to move forward together on this in terms of tackling these issues? Or these type of environmental or climate change issue can become another arena of rivalry? So this is my puzzle, and I want each of you can share.
Anyone in the panel? That's for all the panel?
Maybe I can ask Jonathan and Dr. Manhit to answer.
Okay,
Yes.
and panelists, feel free to direct your answer back to the South China Sea so we stay focused. Manny Bautista, second question before we go back to the panel.
Not really a question. I just like to point out because Professor Cho mentioned that mentioned about transparency being a hindrance to Chinese investment. In fact, Professor Manhit here cited an example of the reverse of transparency during the Duterte era, where in fact we didn't even get anything, very minimal. And for one, who cares about Chinese investments if that is going to be used to coerce us anyway? And we saw a glimpse of that already from, I'm sorry, Dr. Yi, of how that can happen. So, just my thoughts.
And gentleman in the second row.
Just 2 points. The good doctor mentioned. Me. You know, I was a very junior officer in our Department of Foreign Affairs in 1995, when our Chinese counterparts told us straight to our face, "Don't worry, it's a fisherman's shelter." So you can look at it now. Those are some fishermen they have. So our friends from Korea, be worried. Be very worried. But my second and more serious point to our Chinese friend. You know, we talk too much about the economy, oil, etc., but the Filipino people react viscerally when the small are victimized. And I would recommend you watch a little Filipino documentary, not by the government, not even with government money, called Fresh Delivery from the West Philippine Sea. It's a documentary that won a prize in New Zealand, which the Chinese government tried to stop. It shows the victimization of small Philippine sustenance fishermen in the West Philippine Sea, fishing in places where their fathers and their grandfathers had fished before them. This is deeply, deeply affecting the psyche of people when the little ones, the small ones, are hurt. So this is just to our Chinese friends understand how we feel.
Thank you. You are free to make interventions, but I'm going to continue until I've got 3 questions.
Okay.
Peter Lee.
Thank you for that fantastic discussion. My name is Peter Lee from the Asan Institute in Korea. I just wanted to pick up on a point that Professor Che was mentioning, and my question is to Professor Manhit. So South Korea might not be, at the forefront of, joint patrols and pushing back in the South China Sea. At the same time, I think it's going to be a very important partner for the Philippines in building the capacity to push back against China in the South China Sea. And so recently, for instance, the South Korean government and the US have announced a $150 billion shipbuilding cooperation deal. I think that is going to have significant impacts here in the Philippines, given your shipbuilding capacity. So I'm curious how you think South Korea could help in the industrial economic security side, as opposed to, patrolling the seas.
Great. And anyone else with a question? I see over at the end there. Just wait for the microphone to come.
Hope we can remember it.
I'm formally from Lowy Institute. I have a question for Dr. Sophie. I agree with you that negotiations and hotline are important, but they are not useful when they are being weaponized as weapons. I give you 2 examples. Shortly after President Marcos visited Beijing, Beijing actually switched off all hotline communications, and Philippines have a problem to communicate their issues with Beijing. Manila have problem to inform Beijing about their issues on the South China Sea. Second, when I interviewed the ASEAN negotiators in the Code of Conduct, quite a number of them mentioned to me that China is using the talk as to divide and conquer ASEAN. For example, they approached country A, they said, I'm giving you something extra, I don't give anything else to the other country. So how can negotiations and hotline be effective if they are being abused by a certain actor? Thank you.
All right, thanks. So in order, for anyone on the panel, but it was for 2 in particular, I think Jonathan and Victor on climate change and environment as well. To Victor specifically, how can South Korea help on the economic vector? And then to Sophie on hotlines and the abuse of information, if I can put it that way.
Maybe I'll start the easy question on climate change. It was a great question from our JETRO colleague. First of all, of course, in principle, I think we can all agree that this is an international shared good and a regional good. I think the problem and the rub lies in the fact that even if you see some of the activities, of course, principally, which China has been doing in the past with its island building, with its near constant presence of access denial in the South China Sea, that's naturally antithetical to the climate itself. So that's one point of it. The second point, and I think every foreign ministry is sort of guilty of this, and ours as well, is that it's very easy to have a talking point, say we want to have engagement on climate change, and particularly with the People's Republic of China. I agree that's something that's laudable in principle, but going to this first point, Ewan, that I made about the bifurcation of economics and security, this is true for the tools that different states use. And the Chinese will often use the climate tool as well and leverage that in negotiations when it's useful for it. So sometimes if there's a problem politically or in the security field, all of a sudden discussions on climate are no longer palatable or no longer useful. So in principle, yes, I think it's important to have discussions on climate in the region, but with that razor-eyed understanding that not all parties view that as a siloed discussion that you can have that is protected from all of the political and other economic shocks.
Victor, if you'd like to take both
Yes,
questions at
yes.
once, but I'm also going to allow Professor Che to come in on the Korean point, so we also have a right of response from the Korean panelists on what Korea should be
Of
doing.
course,
I
on
think it's
the
very-
environment, we really need to collaborate, to cooperate. And that's one of I think the position of our government, especially the reality that we are a vulnerable country, one of the high-risk countries in terms of this climate change. We feel it during summer. We feel it during rainy season. Imagine this is autumn to a lot of you guys. There should be no rains, but we just got hit by high storms, and there's a storm, so make sure you leave the country by Saturday, because there's a stronger storm from the previous storm. So can you imagine the we live that reality now, and we did not even contribute much in the emissions. That's a reality. On the question, there is a lot of potential. Exactly in this room, we just this week, it's been a busy week, but Monday there was a discussion, roundtable between the Philippines and sponsored by the Korean government on how do we work together in terms of security cooperation with the United States. And one of the speakers is actually here, General Manny Bautista, on how can we maximize. But on the economic side also, I think Korea remains after EU. You are our fourth most important trade and investment partner. And your investment in Subic, it's a good example of trilateral. An American private equity firm giving an opportunity for Hyundai to build the ships. And again, on the part of the Philippines, to have our own workers to be employed so they can consume and they can attain our economic growth, which is 5 to 6%, which is our target. So there is that strong potential, and we hope to gain more. And a lot of your young people are also sent here to study English, and also families being sent here. So there's a strong people to people that also leads to strong economic relationship.
Professor Che, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with what Tindo just said. My sense is that in terms of the geo-economic location and interest, right? A lot of people have asked me over the years. I mean, South Korea is in the same geopolitical position like Japan, right? Then why you don't speak out? Why you don't really criticize the coercive things happen, right? But in my opening remarks, as I said, I mean, we have, first of all, North Korea, right? And also my personal view is that we still have very high expectation about quote unquote constructive role of China in Korean Peninsula. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I mean, still, I mean, for example, if you look at the discussion between President Lee and President Xi Jinping, right? I mean, I believe in the sincerity of this discussion. I really hope that China really could play a constructive role. But I think my message is that don't expect the same kind of reactions. For example, like very strong language criticism. I mean, if you look at the statements when the ramming and the water cannoning, all these things happen. I mean, good news is that since the President Lee took office on June 4th, the new government, right? Under the new government, we have a 4 statement of concern when things happen, right? But the language is very watered down, very weak, right? But the message is clear, right? So we do care. We have our own concern and position, right? But these hard security areas are not what we are really competitive. So infrastructure, shipbuilding, defense cooperation, development cooperation, there are a lot of areas that really help you to enhance the economic resilience and security. I think these are the areas that South Korea can play. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. The curious thing about North Korea is it's always a demand on South Korea's strategic attention, but it's also made South Korea a de facto island. So in terms of focusing maritime attention, it cuts both ways, doesn't it? Yeah. Sophie, you had one question specifically directed to you, but feel free to respond to any of the earlier interventions as well if you want.
Thank you. I'll just touch on very briefly on climate change, because I work for the UN, United Nations in China for a few years, and that is something that the UN in China really works on, and we work with not just the Chinese government, well, by we is when I work for them, but also the different foreign missions in China as well. So we host conferences on green industry very often in Beijing. And if you haven't traveled to China very recently, I encourage you to do so, because if you come to Beijing, you will see, or even all across China, all the taxis or Ubers or either private or public, they are all electrical vehicles. So I think you need to think about China in a way that is just not look at it from the outside, but also look at it from the inside. China has been a very inward-looking country. We care more about what is going inside the country rather than outside of the country. I think the main concern for Chinese government is not what happens outside, but what happens inside China. So Chinese government put a lot of energy because we have a top-down kind of structural institutional structure, so it's a lot easier for policies like green transition to happen in China. Not just the taxis are green, but also many other things that you can look for. But I also wanted just to touch on the Korean Peninsula thing. I think China's constructive role is, if you think of it this way, I think Trump is very eager to get a conversation or meeting with Kim when he was in Korea, but it didn't quite happen. And if you think of what is happening just at the macro level, DPRK sent troops to the Ukraine front lines. So the relationship between Trump, Kim, and President Xi, and also Putin has kind of given us a very different scenario of where we are heading. So I think when you talk about the constructive role of China on Korean Peninsula issues, you can't leave out that image. And on the hotlines. So I have been in a panel with a 4-star journal from the US before, just a few weeks back. So we had a very interesting conversation, and he said that, China didn't really quite pick up the phone on the hotline with the US. And he criticized it, of course. And I said, of course, China wouldn't pick up the phone because the Chinese Minister of Defense was under U.S. sanctions. Why should China pick up the phone when the U.S. didn't even respect the Chinese officials? I mean, the only way for China to have a workable relationship or risk management mechanism that is working is to show respect. And that goes to not just the US, but also other middle and smaller powers. And I think I sympathize with a lot of the comments that I received, but, mutual respect is the only way that we can move things forward.
Can I just interrogate that? Because the understanding, just a second, the understanding of hotlines is that they must function in a crisis to be effective. And it seems counterintuitive to say that a hotline only works when relations are good, which...
I'm not really hinting that, but let me just give you a bit more kind of context about what I'm hinting on. I think during my time here in Philippines, I'm very grateful to be here because I feel a different kind of reaction when I interact with Filipino people. Is very friendly, and but when you're talking about the institutional separation between the actions of the Coast Guards and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here, the words coming out of the Foreign Affairs is very different from the actions from the Coast Guards in Philippines. So I think there needs to be a consistency between at the diplomatic level and at the operational level, because this is how China works. We talk on the diplomatic tables, and then we send out the commands to the operational level. We don't work reversely. So this is I think the basic kind of conditions that one needs to understand when interacting with Chinese.
Okay. Time is running short. I just want to make sure that our questions are directed on the topic, which is South China Sea focused. I know we're going a little bit broader in scope. Over at the back, I saw Neil and Ian Chung. We'll get those two first. Keep it as brief and to the point as possible, please.
Hello. Very briefly, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the wonderful exchange and presentations. Now, UNCLOS says that the littoral states and other states interested in a semi-enclosed sea can cooperate for the development and maintenance of that under Part 9 of UNCLOS. What are the prospects of implementing Part 9 now as a joint, as a development mechanism involving both littoral state, external states, and international organizations for both the management of the South China Sea, but also as a confidence-building mechanism? Thank you.
Are you referring to, is it Article 123 in particular?
Yeah, no, sorry. Chapter 9 of UNCLOS, Part 9 of UNCLOS concerning management of semi-enclosed seas.
Semi-enclosed, that's right.
By littoral states and other states and international
For any
organizations.
panelist in particular, Neil?
Any panelist,
anyone who
but
wants to respond.
yes,
Okay,
thank you.
great. Thank you for the question. Ian, you can project.
I can, for a second. Thanks. So my question is actually for Professor Che. So this gets onto the economic security bit of the conversation. South Korea had experienced a degree of pressure over THAAD. What was the South Korean response? What were the lessons learned? And what was the actual overall effect on the South Korean economy? Thanks.
No South China Sea angle to that, but I'll...
Well, it's relevant because if we think about coercion...
Okay. Third question, very quickly.
Hi, this is directed to Sophie. So you talked about the China having the hotlines and whatnot, right? So China is a comprehensive security partner with ASEAN in 2021. That means that if we were to have problems, right, between ASEAN and China, then we can have a brief and candid conversation. But you're using the politicizing of the economy with the issues on security, especially on the South China Sea.
Question,
wouldn't that
just cut to the
wouldn't
question,
that
please.
actually defeats the purpose of having the CSP? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So in order, anyone who would like to respond on the first question about the UN Law of the Sea, which has specific provision for semi-enclosed seas for the littoral states to cooperate, can more be done, including non-claimant states? Anyone want to have a crack at that? Okay, we'll let that go. The second question was specifically for Professor Che on THAAD and the Korean experience with economic coercion.
That's why we became to be more interested in Southeast Asia. In 2016-17, you know, the third informal economic sanctions. So that's why we turned to Southeast Asia. So compared to the heydays of the bilateral economic interaction, you talked about the taxes in Beijing, right? 15 years ago, Hyundai set up a joint venture, Hyundai Beijing, right? So all of the taxis in Beijing are Hyundai Beijing taxi, right? You remember? Yeah, but now the Hyundai plus Kia, the market share of the consumer automobile in China is less than 1%. So even if the Hyundai's overall revenue really skyrocketed, so one of the main reasons why Trump take issue with the trade surplus that we incur with the United States. Half of the ROK's, Korea's trade surplus comes from automobile sector. It's Hyundai, Kia. It's almost the monopoly, right? These two brands are actually nominally two brands, right? But owned by Hyundai. So about the coercion, right? My sense is that I'm really interested in comparing Chinese message to the Philippines and Chinese message to South Korea. I see a lot of parallels. Yeah. And this is this Chinese message to Japan and Australia different. So it's a kind of customized kind of approach. But I see a lot of still challenges. If you look at Korea, every 5 years, you have new president, new party taking office. So we have the 5-year single-term presidency. And unfortunately, we have a very high level of political polarization, right? So in 2017, former President Madame Park was in jail. She was first impeached. And then April this year, former President Yoon got impeached. She's now in jail, and his wife is also in jail for corruption charges. So I mean, this is very tragic domestic.
Okay.
So
Have to stop.
yeah. So that's why it's very difficult to have consistent policy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sophie, very briefly, final word to you.
Yeah, sure. I think in contrary to RK, China did have a very consistent policy, either domestically or externally. But I think I would just want to pick up on the taxi stuff. To answer the question, actually, when China cares about what is happening domestically and China is pushing for green technology and electrical vehicles, the Europeans protest because we have an overcapacity because the industrial policy from Chinese government is going too hard, trying to change, to push for that green transformation for China. And that's the unintended outcome, that we have a massive overcapacity in electrical vehicles. And that was the pain for other countries like UK and the European markets. But I mean, this is the harsh reality that we need to all accept. There are winners and losers in economy and global economy, and this is marketization. And why don't we embrace that? Because this is the reality that we live in. And why just don't blame any specific one when this is the ultimate outcome of a natural kind of competition of global economy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I won't attempt a summary here. The clear signal I'm getting is where there is scope for cooperation, it may not necessarily lead directly to the South China Sea, but I think we've certainly underlined the premise that security and maritime security and economic security are fundamentally linked through that issue. Apologies to everyone who wanted to ask a question I didn't get to you. I'm afraid we have to conclude now so that we can make our way back to the Grand Ballroom for the next special session, which is on ASEAN Coast Guards. So please make your way back directly. But before that, please thank the 4 panelists. Thank you for your questions.